Well, good morning. Welcome again to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim as we continue reading The Bishop Who Ate His Boots with Chapter 3, Part 3. After his return to Peel River, Stringer met many Eskimos who had come from the coast to trade at the Hudson's Bay Company post. There was a casual note about the work, as these two extracts from his diary show. June 30th, 1893. Intended to have Eskimo prayers at midday, but some were asleep yet. Went with George and called at the tents. Some asleep, some working. July 6, 1893. As I sat down to supper, George brought Eskimo. Went to the church and had a service and talk on God's love and justice. Attendance, 18. Encouraging. Supper, 11:30 p.m. One of Stringer's great strengths was that he could accommodate himself to this timeless way of life without becoming in the slightest degree irritated or impatient. Towards the middle of July, the annual steamer appeared with the bishop and a number of visitors, in addition to mail and supplies. Before its arrival, Stringer had completed his examinations for priest's orders under the supervision of Archdeacon MacDonald. The ordination took place during the bishop's visit on July 15, 1893. There was the usual air of informality, but some degree of haste, since the ceremony had to be completed by the time the steamer was ready to leave for her return journey. Matins and litany having been said, the bishop preached a sermon on the text. "Therefore, my beloved brethren, be ye steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, forasmuch as ye know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord." The candidates, John Tisieta and Isaac Stringer, were presented by Archdeacon MacDonald. Tisieta, an Indian catechist, was ordained deacon, and read the gospel in Tuckath. Stringer was then ordained priest, after which he read the gospel again, presumably in English. The service lasted for 2.5 hours, and before it drew to a close, the warning whistle of the steamboat sounded. But before it was time to leave, there was an opportunity for all who had taken part in the ordination to share a meal. It was, as Stringer noted, a happy occasion and a good spread. Soon after the departure of the steamer, Stringer paid his second visit to the Eskimo, a husky village of Kittigazik. On his arrival, he received a warm welcome from Chief Quillick, at whose urging he pitched his tent in the center of the village, next to that of the chief. Also prominent in the village was the Kajaji, or council house, a large hut or house about 8 feet in height, having a flat roof with a hole in the center under which a fire was built. Within the council house, seats were arranged all around, and men congregated there to work and talk. On this visit, the missionary had deliberately come without an interpreter, feeling that he would learn the language more quickly if he was compelled to use it. There was the usual string of requests of tea and sugar and tobacco and needles, but for a number of reasons he had decided to give away as little as possible. Just after midnight on the day of his arrival, Stringer made his way to the council house and sat talking with the Eskimos gathered there. They seemed glad to see him, and several thanked him for coming. He had not been in the house long when they started to dance. A man, a woman, stood up first, and began to dance very quietly, but with increasing vigor. Soon the woman was tired and sat down gasping and breathing heavily. Although her gasping continued and her breathing seemed more labored and difficult, she soon stood up again, sprang to the center of the room, and began to dance even more violently. Another woman, taking off her bead ornaments and allowing her long hair to fall freely about her, stood up and threw herself into the dance with shouts and yells and many body contortions and gyrations, often falling down, but continuing to dance as those standing by helped her to her feet. Meanwhile, the man was dancing with increasing speed, urged on by the periodic contributions of the singers and drummers. Soon he pulled off his shirt and continued with even greater intensity. He wore an eagle beak and feathers in his hair, and the contortions of his body were dreadful to behold. Every nerve seemed to tingle. After about an hour, he began to take great bounds around the room, pausing before certain individuals and muttering what seemed to be unintelligible gibberish. The young missionary was almost sorry he had come, and was certainly beginning to feel that it was time to make his escape, when, with the eyes of all upon him, the male performer brandished a large knife close to him. His host smiled reassuringly, and at length the dance came to an end. Greatly relieved, Stringer made his way to his tent and to bed. During his stay with the Eskimos, he preached and taught, and his ministrations were gladly received, even though the Oblate missionaries were in the vicinity. He told them some gospel stories, and spoke to them of the love of God in sending his Son, Jesus Christ, to seek and save. He also taught them 4 hymns which they memorized, and he enjoined upon them the importance of kneeling to pray, and of refraining from work on Sundays. Toward the end of August, the Eskimos prepared to leave their summer camp and go to various hunting grounds. At the same time, Stringer prepared to return to Peel River. Before leaving, he arranged to take an Eskimo boy back with him for the winter. Kalukotok was about 15 years old, and a good all-round specimen of an Eskimo. He was the son of a chief named Takulchinkala, and the adopted son of Kochiklik, the chief of the Kitagatsu. The Eskimos were not anxious at first to let him go, and Stringer did not press the matter, but at length they acquiesced. His thought was that Kalukotuk could help him with the Eskimo language and with some of the household chores, while in return he could give Kalukotuk some elementary schooling. Later in the summer, looking forward to the day when he would be joined by a wife, Stringer began to plan for his own house. His first thought was to purchase an old store, which the Hudson's Bay Company no longer used. Before he could do so, however, he found that it had already been sold to the Roman Catholic priest. As a temporary expedient, he bought a small old house from an Indian named Andrew Bonnetbloom, for which he paid 25 skins. In the months following, he made plans for its renovation and extension. In May of 1894, Stringer set out once more for the coast, taking Kalukotuk with him. This time, rather than live in a tent of his own, he stayed among the Eskimos. It had disadvantages, but on the other hand he came to know them more intimately and was not pestered by requests. He spent his time visiting, talking with them, ministering to the sick, and endeavoring to increase his knowledge of their language. Towards the end of the month, 3 dog sleds arrived from the whaling ships, and Stringer was sorry to see they had brought whiskey with them. Before long, 3 bottles had appeared in the tent where he was staying, and in no time they were dancing and staggering around after the manner of drunkards in general. However, there were no serious consequences, and the next day the Eskimos were working hard to get their boats and canoes in order. By the middle of June, they had decided it was time for them to move toward Fort McPherson for their summer trading. Accordingly, everything was packed up, and they made their leisurely pilgrimage. It was at this time that the Eskimos decided to have nothing further to do with the Roman Catholic mission. An Oblate priest, Constant Guru, had taken up residence at Fort McPherson in April of 1890, and with the assistance of an Indian had built a log mission house. In 1892 he was joined by a companion, Camille Lafebre, who became responsible for the work among the Eskimos. According to Whitaker, they were known to the native people as the Black Priest and the Red Priest by the color of their hair. Lefebvre, the Red Priest, made more or less regular trips to Kitigatzuk and occasionally met Stringer on the same errand. Just before leaving at the end of one of these visits, Lefebvre had distributed a number of scapulars which he had told the Eskimos to wear as protection against drowning or other misfortunes. When he had gone, some of the Eskimos told Stringer what had happened. When they learned that he considered such a use of the scapulars to be superstitious, they threw them in the river. Following this incident, in July of 1894, Lefebvre had called on the Eskimos in their tents at Fort McPherson and had instructed them that those who wished to be saved were to come to his house when he rang the bell. Unimpressed by his language and dictatorial manner, they ignored the summons. After a considerable interval, the chief and his wife climbed the hill to see him. Angered by the failure of the Eskimos to comply with his instructions, the priest was in no mood to afford cordial reception to his visitors. Taking paper into his hands, he tore it to shreds and flung it into the fire, saying that if they were going to be Protestants, they would burn like that in hell, but if they would turn and follow him, he would save them. Angry and frightened, the chief and his wife left the Red Priest's house and went to see Stringer and the archdeacon. After a long talk, they sent word to the oblate missionary not to come their way again. One account adds the threat that if he did so, his life would not be safe. Meanwhile, they said to Stringer they would attend his services and listen to his words. Difficulties increased for the Oblates in 1896, and they withdrew from Fort McPherson. During this same period, Julian Stewart Camsell, the chief factor of the Hudson's Bay Company at Fort Simpson, was visiting Fort McPherson. Stringer seized the opportunity to suggest that he and John Firth should join with the archdeacon and himself in a request to the whalers to cease giving liquor to the Eskimos and the Indians. Stringer had already made representations to the ship's officers, but without any great effect. He now felt that more pressure should be brought to bear. The proposal met with general agreement, and before Camsell left, the following letter had been drawn up and signed. Hudson's Bay Company, Peel's River, July 10, 1894. To the captains whaling in the Arctic Ocean. Gentlemen, some of the Eskimos and Indians have been in the habit of receiving liquor from some of the whaling ships wintering in Herschel Island. This is strictly forbidden by the laws of Canada, and we would earnestly request you to use your best effort to prevent this in future, both in the interests of morality and for the welfare of the natives, and also to ask those who may replace you from time to time to cooperate with this desirable object. Yours, R. MacDonald, D.D., Archdeacon, CMS, J.S. Camsell, F.C., Hudson's Bay Company, John Firth, I.C. of Peel River, and I.O. Stringer, missionary to the Eskimos. At the end of July, Stringer set out again by canoe on his long itinerary. With him were 2 Indians, Peter Tussell and Enoch Moses. They made their way down the Peel River and reached Nelson Fishery at 2:30 a.m. at the end of the first day's traveling. Here they visited the Indians and finally retired at 6 o'clock in the morning, sleeping until midday. After 2 more days, Enoch complained of feeling ill, and they were unable to proceed for a full day. As they went, Peter Tussell told the missionary some of the legends and traditions of his people. At length they reached Point Separation and made their way to the Mackenzie Delta, arriving at Kittigatsuk on August 7th. A day or so after his arrival, Stringer was summoned to the council house, where he found an Eskimo with a very white face. He had been lying on some shavings where children had left a knife, and the point had pierced his thigh. He had already treated the wound by covering it with tobacco. The missionary thought it best to leave it undisturbed, but promised to apply some medication later. The Eskimo seemed relieved by his reassurance. Perhaps they were slowly accepting Stringer as a friend and helper. Several Eskimos were present the next Sunday as he had prayers with his Indian helpers. Afterwards they asked him a great many questions about religious matters. Had he seen God? Had he been to heaven, since he seemed to know so much about these things? A hard question, noted Stringer in his diary. With my limited knowledge of their language, I just told them I had learned all from God's book. Peter had a card with a picture of angels on it, and he asked me if they were all women. With unconscious humor, he added, my head began to ache, so I took a walk. Was it the confidence of youth which had made him feel that it was only the limitation of language which made it difficult for him to answer the questions? The missionary band left for Herschel Island on August 22nd, but before doing so, Stringer dispensed medicines for a number who were ill, including 2 cases of syphilis. They were delayed by storms at Sabine Point, and did not reach the island until September 3rd. As they were entering Pauline Cove, 2 ships sailed out. Peter Tussell hailed them in broken Slav, and they replied. Stringer made no attempt to identify himself, thinking that they would return later. Great was his disappointment on landing to discover that they were the ships of Captains Norwood and Smith, whom he particularly wished to see. Moreover, they were the last ships to leave before the winter, so that the mail he had brought with him could not now be sent until the following summer. Equally unfortunately, his winter supplies from San Francisco had not arrived. At the whaling company's house on the island, he found Captain E.C. Murray, who would be remaining to care for the company's property during the winter. He hospitably invited the missionary to stay with him while on the island, and this Stringer was glad to do, although he found that the billiard table on which he slept was not the most comfortable of beds. Some of his time he spent in helping his host to shingle the roof. The rest he spent with the Eskimos. He gathered them together frequently, and with David Copperfield acting as interpreter, held services and taught them something of the Christian gospel. While at Herschel Island, 7 or 8 whaling ships came, most of them to winter at Pauline Cove. Captains J. McKenna of the Fearless and B. Cogan of the Northern Light intended to go as far as Shingle Point to investigate the possibility of wintering there. They invited Stringer and his helpers to go with them. The missionary accepted this, as it would take him part of the way to Peel River. They left on September 13th, but when they arrived the next day, the sea was too rough for them to put to shore. There was no alternative but to return to Herschel Island. Instead, the captains offered to give him a whaleboat, which he accepted. When they reached the island once more, all the other captains helped to supply the parts missing from the boat. Captains Coffin and G.W. Porter gave Stringer provisions in place of those which had failed to arrive from San Francisco. Equipped in this way, Stringer and his helpers set out on September 15th for Fort McPherson. It was late in the season, and they could not travel as fast as they might have done with a canoe. Moreover, Stringer was not a sailor, and found it difficult at times in handling the whaleboat. All went well, however, and after pausing to visit the Eskimos along the way, and rowing and tracking for a good part of 2 weeks' journey, they reached Fort McPherson on October 2nd. Earlier in 1894, Stringer had written to Bishop Reeve, suggesting and even urging the appointment of an additional missionary for the Western Arctic. If such an appointment were made, he felt the Eskimo work need not be dependent on the Indian mission. It would also be possible to devote more time to Herschel Island and to the other areas at the time untouched. In the same letter he mentioned the possibility of going home on furlough during 1895. He was not sure, he said, whether Archdeacon MacDonald would be going out that year. If so, it would be impossible for him to go, as they could not both be away at the same time. Should the Archdeacon decide to remain, Stringer had the promise of passage to San Francisco in one of the whalers leaving the Arctic at the end of the summer. MacDonald finally decided that his work of translating the Bible into Tukhoth would take another year, and that he would not be ready to go until 1896. This left Stringer free, as he had hoped, to go out in 1895. In the spring of 1895, Stringer made a further trip to Herschel Island. He spent Easter Day en route and arrived at the island on April 16th. Captain John A. Cook of the whaling steamer Navarch mentioned this in his biography, and added that on the following Sunday the missionary held a service, quote, "in a house that we used for a billiard room. The service was largely attended," unquote. According to Stringer's diary, there were 90 to 100 people present from the whaling ships. Separate services have been held for the Eskimos. At 6 o'clock in the morning of May 8th, Mrs. Elbert C. Sherman, the wife of the captain of the Beluga, gave birth to a daughter. The service on the following Sunday was held on board the ship and was attended by practically the whole of the white community. The 4-day-old infant was baptized and given the name Helen Herschel. During this visit, Stringer was also able to discuss the vexatious question of giving liquor to the native peoples. At a meeting of the captains, he presented the statement which had been prepared and signed at Fort McPherson the previous year. The missionary added teeth to his argument by saying that, if an undertaking were not forthcoming, he would feel it his duty to notify the authorities and to seek to have the situation corrected by legal means. The matter was discussed at length. All seemed willing to agree in prohibiting the distribution of liquor, but many seemed to think that the agreement would not be kept. Finally, all signed an undertaking which might be expected to put an end to the traffic. The missionary set out for his return journey with Peter Tussel, who had arrived from Fort McPherson with the mail a few days previously. After leisurely visits along the way, which included calls at Tent Island, Colville Island, and Kitigatsuk. They reached Fort McPherson on June 16th. It was not many days before the Wrigley arrived on her annual visit. Greatly to Stringer's delight, the passengers included a recruit for the Eskimo work in the person of Charles Edward Whittaker. Also on board was Bishop Reeve, who, in the course of this northern visit, was anxious to see the work at Herschel Island. During the steamer's brief stay, there were services and conferences and stores to be unpacked. Curios and other prized possessions which Stringer had collected during his stay had been packed in boxes and were now taken on board to be shipped to his home in Ontario. A week or so after the steamer's departure, Stringer, accompanied by the bishop and Whittaker, set out with the men in the whaleboat for Kitigatsuk and Herschel Island. The journey followed Stringer's usual pattern and included numerous calls en route, so that they reached the island after about 3 weeks. Here they held services and meetings with the Eskimos and with the men of the whaling ships. During the visit, the bishop held a meeting with about 35 of the officers in which he spoke to them of the possibility of establishing a mission on the island. He referred also to the liquor traffic and emphasized the desirability of its complete elimination. Matters were discussed informally. One or two of the captains said they had only signed the understanding under protest, but all agreed to do their best to keep it. All were agreed as well that a mission on Herschel Island would be beneficial, and a subscription list was opened to which most of them contributed. A sod house was purchased from one of the officers for $30, and a small store for $150 as temporary accommodation for the missionary until permanent arrangements could be made. The bishop and Whittaker set out on a return voyage to Fort McPherson on August 31st, leaving Stringer to make the long journey by sea to San Francisco, then overland to his home. And that's the end of Chapter 3. Next week we'll continue with Chapter 4. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.